What's up, everybody? My name's Pantsface, and today I want to talk about playing Shadow Priest in TOGC. Now, this isn't going to be going over perfect strategies for each fight. I think those are still being developed, and I know my guild's going to be trying a lot of different stuff in the upcoming raid test. But what I want to talk about today is kind of regardless of strategy, what you can do as a Shadow Priest to maximize your damage and to help your guild out the most, or your raid, on the fights in TOGC. Now, if you like this content, don't forget to give me a like and subscribe, as it helps me out a lot and I do appreciate it. Alright, with that being said, let's get into it. Now, before we get started, what I want to talk about is the basic talent and glyph setup that we're going to use on some of these fights. Now, not all fights, we're going to be doing a little bit of changing here and there, but I think the important thing to know is that this is slightly different than what I've recommended in the past. Now, the talent setup differs because it takes 2 points from Focus Mind and puts them into improved VE. I really like this just because there's kind of a lot of AoE damage just throughout the raid, and I am always someone where on progression, I like to help out my raid as much as I can through extra healing. So if you want the extra mana, then I totally recommend, taking those points out of VE and going for Focus Mind. Really just kind of do what works for you, but again, for a new raid, for progression, this is what I found to work best for me. Now, glyphs. I found Glyph of Dispersion to actually be kind of wasted in this raid. It's not something that I would recommend for every fight just because I don't think you're getting a ton of value out of it. So what I would recommend here as that third glyph is Glyph of Shadow Word Pain. Mana is not particularly an issue, but the other glyphs just kind of have niche uses and we don't really need them. So we don't need a Glyph on Mindseer on most of these fights. We don't need Glyph of Dispersion on most of these fights. So I think Shadow Word Pain is just kind of a nice catch-all for mana. But again, this is kind of like your mileage may vary and you can kind of do what you want here. But again, this is just my recommendation. Let's kick things off with Northrend Beasts. So here we're going to use the normal talent setup and the normal glyph setup. And this is actually a fight that I really do like Glyph of Shadow Word Pain for, and I'll talk about it when we get there. Now, for the first part of the fight, you're going to be fighting against Gormak. Here, just spread out from people in your raid because he's going to be throwing fire pools at you. It's going to target a player. You want to make sure that you don't have too many people stacked in the same spot. And then these snowballs are going to jump out and latch onto people. If they latch onto you, you're basically screwed for parsing on this fight because they're going to constantly interrupt whoever they're on. So I would just recommend spamming Devouring Plague until it dies. Now, what you want to do is basically run it into a melee or wherever your cleave group is to just kind of kill them as fast as you can. But if you're lucky enough to not have one on you, then just multi-dot them. So throw up a VT and a Shadow Word Pain, and make sure you keep refreshing Shadow Word Pain with a 2-tick Mind Flay when it's about to fall off, and then reapply Vampiric Touch, assuming you're going to get the full duration out of the spell. So while you're doing that, you're just maintaining full DPS onto Gormak, and you'll probably be top 5 by the end of this boss on the DPS meters. Shadow's really good at cleaving on this fight. Now, on the transition, it's likely you're going to have some snowbolts alive, which is why I really like Glyph of Shadow Word Pain. Normally, in fight transitions such as this, you have some downtime and you can use Dispersion. But I found myself usually having around 8 to 9k mana going into the 2 Jermungers who spawn next, and not having enough time to disperse because we still had snowballs alive that we were DPSing. So Glyph of Shadow Word Pain is going to do a lot of heavy lifting just to help you recover your mana to make sure that when you can finally disperse, you're not totally So anyway, after Gormak dies, you're going to have these 2 Jermungers spawn. One is acid based and one is fire based, and we're still trying to figure out which one is best to kill, but we've been having a lot of luck killing acid guy first. Anyway, you're going to have one target that's your main target, and that's going to be like your DP, your Mind Flaying, and then the other one, again, just maintain dots on. So have your Vampiric Touch and your Shadow Word Pain. Make sure you keep refreshing them. Make sure your Shadow Word Pain doesn't fall off. Again, stay spread out. You really don't want to be stacked here because each Jermunger is going to be doing a spray, and if that hits a target that's near you or is targeted near you and you're standing in a stack of people, everybody in that stack is going to get the debuff. And in order to get rid of it, if you have the acid debuff or the fire debuff, you just have to go and touch another player who has the opposite debuff and it'll clear it from you. Now, after a minute or so, I'm not quite sure how long it is, but both Jermungers are going to burrow into the ground. This is a perfect time to use Dispersion to restore some mana. And again, which is why we're using Glyph of Shadow Word Pain here, because this comes, a good bit into the fight, and it's extremely likely that you'd be or very close to it if you didn't have the Glyph of Shadow Word Pain. At least that's what I was finding on my attempts with this fight. So use Disperse and then get back into it, and that's all for this fight. Really just maintain your dots on your off target, make sure you're focusing your main target, and stay spread out. Next up, we have Ice Howl. Now, Ice Howl is it's just a single target fight, but it is pretty good for Shadow for one really specific reason. So cast at max range, stay spread out because he has an AoE breath that's just going to freeze people in a cone away from Ice Howl. So you don't want too many people stacked in the same area. And then eventually he's going to jump into the center, knock everybody against the walls, pick someone to charge at, and hopefully he doesn't hit anybody while charging. And if he doesn't, he'll hit the wall and take 100% increased damage for 10 or 15 seconds. Now this is awesome for Shadow Priest. You want to use your Shadow Fiend, you want to use your Haste Potion if you still have it up. You want to use any cooldowns you have. Now, the most important thing about this is the second before it ends, your final global into this increased damage period, you want it to be a Devouring Plague. Now, if you're not familiar with how Devouring Plague works with like snapshotting these kinds of buffs, then it's actually going to take that 100% increased damage and it's going to stay applied to that Devouring Plague for its entire duration, even after Ice Howl comes out of this dazed phase. This has to do with Devouring Plague being classified as a drain effect. So other fights where it snapshots like this is on Thorum, for example. If you cast Devouring Plague while he's still standing up on the balcony and he takes 99% reduced damage, well, guess what? Even when he jumps down, that Devouring Plague is still doing 99% reduced damage. Or on Mimiron phase 3, when the head is spinning and it comes down to the ground and takes, I think, 50% increased damage, you can snapshot Devouring Plague there and get that extra damage buff. Even after he starts flying back up into the air, it will maintain that damage buff. So on Ice Howl, you can do a ton of damage and potentially be the highest damage dealer of your raid in the Ice Howl phase if you really maximize your damage during that dazed period. But that's it for Northrend Beasts. Just keep DPSing, he'll die, and you'll probably be top 3, if not top 1 on this fight. It is a very good fight for Shadow, which unfortunately isn't really true for the rest of the fights here. Alright, let's hop into Lord Jaraxxus, Eridar Lord of the Burning Legion. Now, even though he is a really cool voice line and is a prominent Hearthstone card, his fight is really underwhelming. Here we're going to use the standard talent setup and glyph setup, and really this is a single target fight with some minor add cleave. So outside of the single target portion of this fight, Jaraxxus is going to spawn 2 things that essentially spawn other creatures. So one is called a Nether Portal and one is a Volcano. The Nether Portal is going to summon Mistresses of Pain and the Volcano is going to summon Infernals. It's imperative that both of these things die immediately. You don't want too many enemies spawning because the portal or the Volcano is left up too long. But when the Mistresses are up, just like other ads that we've had in the previous fight, you just maintain your dots on them but still focus fire on Jaraxxus. Now, the Infernos don't really have too much HP. They have like 250k. You might be able to get a Vampiric Touch off on them, but for the most part, I was just ignoring them because they were dying to the melee cleave so fast. Now, the Mistresses of Pain do put out a nasty debuff. It's called Kiss or something along those lines anyway. If you get these debuff, it's going to interrupt you. And what you want to try to do is bait it out with another school of magic because it's going to interrupt your current school of magic. So like if you get interrupted casting a shadow spell, you can still cast holy spells, but that's kind of useless as a shadow priest. So you want to try to bait it out with like a flash of light or a smite or something, just any holy spell that has a cast time. Now, the unfortunate thing is I found that I would usually get this debuff and just immediately get silenced because I was already channeling a mind flay, and it happened almost instantly. Now, there is a way to counter this though. So the Mistresses of Pain don't actually target anyone when this cast goes out. They do have a cast though, and I think the debuff goes on like 5 different targets in your raid. What your paladins can do is if they notice this cast going out is they can aura mastery concentration aura, and this is going to prevent the interrupt from happening. So unfortunately you can't do anything to prevent this, but what you can do is remind your paladins to make sure they aura mastery with concentration aura. But other than that, especially with Lust on this fight, he's just going to die so fast that you're going to basically forget that you were fighting a boss anyway. Next up is Faction Champions. Now, a lot of this fight kind of depends on how your raid does it. I've never had a PvP spec for this fight, but I'm actually going to recommend one, and I'll talk about why. So the spec here and the talent's going to be a lot different than what we've seen so far. So the talent setup here basically just removes all the points from Improved Mind Blast and makes it so that you can get Silence instead that you can get Psychic Horror. And those are going to be important, and I'll explain why. Now, the glyph setup is actually really different. We are losing a bit of damage. So our third glyph is going to be Glyph of Dispersion because we want that reduced cooldown just in case we get targeted by some melee. But then I'm also going to recommend replacing Glyph of Mind Flay with Glyph of Mass Dispel. There is a lot of dispelling, and it does suck to lose damage, but I think the mana reduction from all of the mass dispels we're going to have to be casting is really important. This really is just a survival of the fittest kind of fight. You don't want to die because a dead DPS does a lot less DPS than an alive DPS here. Now Shadow actually has a lot of tools to survive this fight. With Fade, if you get targeted by any enemy, you'll instantly reset their threat table and they'll go target somebody else. So between Fade, Dispersion, Psychic Scream, you have a lot of tools to just peel off of these enemies. But I found that sometimes all of that wasn't enough. I would still get targeted, I could get gripped by the DK, and then just have nothing if I used all three of those abilities in a melee pile and then just get a 100 to 0'd in like half a second. So the additional utility of having Psychic Aura just gives you one final ability just to use in case you have a melee on you. Not only is it great for the stun, but it's also a 10-second disarm, which means they're going to be hitting you like a wet noodle if they even reach you anyway. Even though it's on a long cooldown, Silence is also really nice just to interrupt a Tranquility or just any healing spell that might be going off just to make the fight that much faster. Again, a lot of this really depends on how your raid is doing this fight. I really valued mana recovery in this fight. I actually swapped one of my trinkets to be Show of Faith because even with the Massive Spell Glyph, I found myself getting a lot and having to use Dispersion for mana instead of survivability. You could sacrifice a few more talents to move further down in the disc tree to further reduce the mana cost of Massive Spell, but I don't think that's necessary. I think that just gives up a little bit too much damage. Next up, we have Twin Valks. So here I would use the normal talent setup and the normal glyph setup. Now, you might actually want Glyph of Dispersion instead of Shadow Word Pain. It kind of depends on how your guild is doing this fight. Whether the hard part for you guys is going to be healing the vortexes or the damage on the shield, because if it's damage from the vortex, you might want Dispersion just so it's one less person for your raid to heal. But again, that kind of depends on how your raid is doing in this fight. So what I would recommend for this fight is just DPS whatever the opposite target of the aura that you have is. I tried maintaining dots on the off target, or like the one that had the same color as my aura, and it just did so little damage that my Shadow Word Pain and Vampiric Touch and like the Mind Flays that I was using to keep my Shadow Word Pain up was around 500 DPS. Your Mind Flay alone on your other target is doing like 4k DPS. So I don't think it's worth it to maintain dots on the other target at all. Now there's one situation where it might be worth it to maintain a Shadow Word Pain, but I'm not sure. And what I mean by that is I've heard from some warlocks that you might be able to, if you're supposed to start with the dark aura, you could actually start with the light aura, put up a Shadow Word Pain onto the dark target, and then switch to the dark aura. Now what this would do is your Shadow Word Pain would be snapshotted with that 150% damage buff instead of the 50% damage reduction, because you would have had the opposite color aura from the shadow target, even though you are now swapping back to the shadow aura so that you can full send your single target into the light twin. I do not know if this works whatsoever. If it does, then your Shadow Word Pain on that other target would probably be around 1k to 1.2k DPS, so it would actually be pretty strong. But again, I have not tested this for myself, so I cannot confirm or deny whether this works. But what I can say is if you are attacking the one of your same color, your spells are going to do so little damage that it's really not worth it. Unless you're doing the strategy where everybody stays the same color and then you just attack the other target anyway when they have the shield up, in which case, obviously you have to. Other than that, him can be a good cooldown during the vortexes if you guys are struggling with damage. Just make sure you have an AM Conqueror, otherwise you will get interrupted while channeling it because you don't have any pushback protection for holy spells. And then if you happen to be a soaker, if you guys are doing that, I did it a lot just because, as we were just trying to figure out the raid, I just happened to be the person who did it. I wouldn't say Shadow's particularly great at doing it, but I also don't think they're that bad. I think my max DPS was around 12.5k on this fight. And then when I was an orb soaker person, I was doing around 9 to 9.5. So it was about 75% of my damage is what I was doing while soaking orbs. Again, not saying Shadow's great at it, but if you're one of the better players, if you're good at, running into orbs and also doing your rotation, then it could be a good way for you to help your raid. But that's really it. There's not too much to min-max on this fight. It really is just a single target fight with a few mechanics here and there sprinkled in. All right, let's get to Anub. So Anub's interesting. Here I do the standard talent setup, and this is kind of why I have those 2 points in VE, because our other talent setup is catered towards faction champions, and this one is catered towards this fight because I find 2 out of 2 VE to be extremely useful for phase 3. And instead of Glyph of Shadow Word Pain, I'd recommend Glyph of Mindseer here, and I'll talk about that as well. So I really like Glyph of Mindseer here because you don't want to just be mind-searing off of a noob when the 4 ads come in surrounding a noob. What you want to be doing to maximize your damage on a noob is pick one of the ads that's actually like closest to a noob and sear off of that. That way you're hitting 3 of the ads plus a noob. You're still hitting 4 targets. One of them just happens to be the boss because it's not so much important in phase 1, but in phase 3, we need to be maximizing our damage on the boss at every point. And we can do this by actually searing off the ads. So it's like we're doing really good damage because the ads do need to die. But here you can AoE and you can still attack a noob with Seer. Now you're not losing too much single target damage doing this. You're definitely losing Spirit Taps that only procs off of Mind Flay and Mind Blast. So with Mind Seer, you're not getting that proc anymore. But the damage isn't too far off from Mind Seer on a single target versus Mind Flay. Obviously it's lower, but you're not losing too much damage on a noob by also AoEing the ads. I would also put up a single VT on each ad as they ran in. I have no idea if this is worth doing. I just found it to be an increase in DPS because, you know, obviously one global of VT does around 15 to 20k damage. But again, I'm not sure if this was worth it. It's just something that I was doing because it felt right, and I don't really have a better explanation than that. So really, that's phase 1 and phase 3 in a nutshell. In phase 2, what you want to do is he'll be chasing around members of your raid and he'll get progressively faster. If you get targeted as the Shadow Priest, what's nice is with Disperse, you'll basically just live for the entire 6 seconds because his hits do around 15 to 20k, and while you're dispersed, they'll do 1500 to 2k. And he hits about once every second, so even in the 6 seconds, if you're taking 2k damage a second, you'll still have 8k health remaining, or maybe even more depending on your total health. So you're fine to just sit in it or sit in his spikes for 6 seconds. What I would recommend is doing that and then asking for a bop when you have about 1 or 2 seconds left on your disperse, and then you can just sit in it even longer and then, you know, run through the ice patch when the bop is about to expire. Shadow's really good for kiting here just because of disperse. Now phase 3, the damage that you're dealing is the same as phase 1. You know, you want to be AoEing off of an ad, make sure you're maximizing your damage onto a noob. Now phase 3 has 2 new mechanics. One is Leeching Swarm that just deals 30% of everybody's current HP to them as damage and then heals a noob for that same amount. And then there's Penetrating Cold, which deals 6k damage every 3 seconds. So there's a fine balance between keeping everybody's health low enough so that they're not healing a noob for a lot, but that they also won't get one shot by Penetrating Cold. Now what I found is that I like 2 out of 2 VE here, and my guild does too, because depending on what group you're in, you can basically sustain them yourself. You will be healing yourself for a ton. So you will be healing a noob because your health will be pretty high, but the rest of your party will be surviving with almost 0 heals required unless they get Penetrating Cold. Now, this is kind of like a weird balance where it really depends on how your guild is doing this fight. 2 out of 2 in VE or improved VE might just be too much overhealing for you and for your group, and your guild might want you to cut back. They might even want you to take off VE entirely. It really just, again, depends on your healers, depends how you're doing this fight. What my healers really liked is whatever group I was in, they could basically ignore healing unless one of those people got Penetrating Cold. So that's why I was 2 out of 2. I'm not saying this is for everybody. I'm just saying it worked really well for us. The other awesome thing is that because your health is so high, you're the perfect person to get Penetrating Cold because you'll still be able just to heal yourself through it because you're already healing yourself for around 2 to 2.5k healing per second with 2 out of 2 improved VE. And Penetrating Cold only does 6k damage every 3 seconds, which is 2k damage per second, and that's before resistances. So with your Frost Auras and whatever, you're going to be taking less damage than 6k. So you're actually the perfect person to get it because you still don't even require any healing. I'm sure you'll still get healing because obviously it's really important to make sure nobody dies, especially you if you're healing the rest of your group. But just something to be aware of. You are the absolute perfect person to get Penetrating Cold in phase 3. And that's all I got for you. I'll definitely have more tips after our next set of raid testing, and I'll probably be doing individual boss guides at that point, talking about, you know, not just Shadow Priest specific things, but also strategies that my guild is utilizing, especially in the progression race. Although those videos won't be coming out until the progression race starts, just because I can't give away our secrets too early. But remember, if you like this content, please like and subscribe, as it does help me out a lot, and I do appreciate all the support that I get from you beautiful people. Anyway, that's all for this video. My name's Pantsface, and I'll see you in the next one.